Hey everyone, Phobos here, coming at you with a new build guide, and this is going to be for the Freezing Pulse Totem Hierophant. Patch version is 3.6, and not too much has changed about the core of the actual build in terms of like how you put the points in and stuff like that, but I have made some more definitive gearing choices, I would say, in this version of the game, and Freezing Pulse did get buffed a bit. So overall, combining those two things, I think that it's made the build a lot stronger than it was previously. Although I think it was already pretty strong, especially just for like generalized mapping. Fairly good clear speed, fairly safe. But now it actually does pretty incredible boss damage as well without having to switch to Ice Spear. But you always have the option to switch to Ice Spear as well for even more boss damage against bosses that are relatively stationary and you can get good Ice Spear connects with. So yeah, thanks for checking this out, and we'll get right into the build. So let's open up the tree first, I guess. Actually, we can talk about the links first. So typically I'll go increase critical strike, freezing pulse, added cold damage, faster casting, hypo, and control destruction. Now, technically critical strikes is not the theoretical best max DPS in this build. If you were to swap this out and go through green with a cold pen, it would be, but I have a couple reasons for going critical strikes. So the first would be just more consistency in terms of the crits, which really helps keep things frozen when you're mapping. Obviously against bosses, if you're going to freeze them, you're probably going to freeze them anyway because you have like 5 totems in this case attacking the same target, so the freeze is going to get off regardless. But against, trash mobs, it's really helpful to just have that little extra bit of crits, so that when you put your totems down, hopefully the first or second shot crits, and they're just frozen in their tracks, can't do anything. Really helps versus like Porcupine, stuff like that. Not to mention, it's a little bit of a pain to get 3 green on here. Not really too much of a pain, like in terms of if you're you have a lot of currency to spend, but if you're tight on currency, then 3 green is a little rough. So that it's not really a main reason, but it just makes it a little easier if you don't have the right colors. And I would say finally, the last reason for critical strike is that if you put pen in here, in terms of crit strike, pen actually gets worse the more you stack it, right? So you're going to be you potentially have the ability to get a lot of outside sources of pen from Frost Bomb, possibly from a curse. Right now we're using projectile weakness, but you could use elemental weakness or frostbite, and those are both elemental or resistance penalty curses, which means they'll get counted towards like the minus cold resist ultimately. You can use a wise oak, which I actually don't have right now in the build. You have stuff like the Pandemonious here, so there's a lot of ways to get cold pen, and if you get cold pen in your slot here, you're kind of like wasting a slot in a sense, because the cold pen is not going to be, from your other sources, is not going to be as effective, and crit is essentially the same DPS as cold pen, but it has the added utility, and the fact that cold pen's damage is probably going to suffer like the more curses and stuff you have on the mob. So if you're ever in a party where you have frostbite and elemental weakness or something like that, you might actually see crit coming out to be like the better gem here. So just a little talk about that. In terms of the general build, we're using Soul Mantle. I feel like Soul Mantle is still generally super strong for totems. Pretty much one of the best options. I mean, between having a level 20 spell totem, the totem life, a little bit of totem damage, decent ES, getting the extra totem, and getting the implicit link in your totem because you no longer have to use spell totem is just like super good. And when you combine the fact that it gives you curses and you mitigate the curse harmfulness via the Kikazarus, which means you're actually getting damage from the curses via self-flagellation jewel, 20% each curse if you have a max rolled one. It's actually just kind of really hard to turn down the combination of like basically the damage and the utility, and you're basically curse immune. Now you are suffering from lack of life on rings, I would say is the main drawback to the setup, but I think ultimately it's pretty worth it, and you can do other setups to get more life if you want than this. Currently doing a setup on hardcore right now that has, it's like level 85, it has 5k life. It's going to have like more than that by the time it gets to level 90, and similar amount of other defenses, so you'll be quite a bit tankier. This character's already pretty tanky as it is. Survives just fine against endgame bosses and endgame maps and stuff like that. So the only other, in terms of alternative chest options, I've been thinking of potentially trying to play around with the new Shaper chest, I believe it is, that gives % of cold damage added, or % of elemental damage added as chaos per Shaper item. But I don't think we're still not really going to reach the damage threshold, or the amount of damage you're going to get with Soul Mantle, because you're not going to get the extra totem. You're losing the curse immunity. You're losing essentially the self-flagnation setup, which is a lot of damage. So I don't think you'd get the same damage. You'd get more life for sure, because you could run 2 life rings, and the chest itself gives life. So if you're really trying to push your life to super high values, that's probably an option. But I think this is a pretty good budget option, especially because getting all your items to be Shaper items, it's kind of expensive, and it's not even really ideal in a lot of cases. So there's that. Now, going into the rest of the gear, this stuff is all pretty top tier. I think damage to Shaper right now is around 500k per totem with Freezing Pulse. I haven't even really checked with Ice Spear, but it's really high. Ice Spear, by the way, right here, you just swap this into the Freezing Pulse slot, and then you have a GMP, which I don't have in here right now, but you just swap the GMP in for added cold, because it's actually more damage, because it gives more projectiles. And then you swap in a Rain of Splinters in for a First Snow. If you really want, you can actually have, if you're going to be like doing some content where you're swapping all the time, you can have the Rain of Splinters kind of like already in place of the First Snow, because you don't really lose that much. It's like 70% damage overall, or like 50% damage, but it's increased damage, so it's not like a huge deal if you're not doing like super endgame stuff. So that's an option. You can also, if you really want, you can put the LMP in place of one of the green gems, and then just swap in the damage gem, but you'll lose a lot more damage that way, obviously, because you're sacking added cold, which is pretty huge, because Freezing Pulse just got a damage effectiveness buff, which was pretty significant. I think it was like 25% additional effectiveness. So you'd be losing the damage from this, as well as getting the like 30% less from GMP, so wouldn't be too good for Freezing Pulse specifically. But yeah, so that's the swap, by the way. And in terms of the rest of the gear, so like I said, this is all pretty good stuff, but you can make do on a much easier budget. I didn't really have an insane scepter or shield for a long time. I actually didn't even have the +1 to additional totems for a shield for a long time, and you don't really notice it that much. It's mostly just additional single target damage increase, and I will say on some fights it's really good to have the additional totem. In terms of like doing some delves and stuff like that, it can feel kind of nice, because what ends up happening is, since you're Heirophant and you have Ritual of Awakening, you place 2 totems down every time you cast, right? So you put 2 and 2. So if you have a 4 totem max limit, and you have 2 sets of totems down, when you go to place your next totem, it's going to take away all the totems from this position, right? So it's like basically if you were to try to set up totems around a boss and you put some here and you put some here, you would have, and then you go to like put another set here, it would completely remove the first set, okay? And it would keep the second 2 set, and you'd have here and here. So with this setup, you actually still have 1 totem attacking from this angle, so you can kind of just like cover more space that way. And this is kind of like one of the weaknesses about placing the 2 totems at a time. It's a very good like burst damage up front for clearing packs, but in a situation where you want to cover a lot of area in some sense you are losing a bit of freedom in terms of where you place your totems because you're hitting the totem cap limit earlier. And what that's causing it to do is remove the prior totems, right? So this is a nice way to circumvent that a bit when you get 5 totems and at least you have 1 totem up in the prior spot. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's why I think having 5 totems is a really good sweet spot for this build. But like I said, off the bat, it's really not necessary at all. So there's that. And we can actually just go over the shield in detail here. So it doesn't look like much on the surface, but it's actually kind of an insane shield because it has +1 to maximum number of totems. With socketed gems have 10% reduced mana reservation. That can technically go up to 15, but it's still really hard to get both of those together on the shield. And in this case, we have cast speed, spell crit, and then it had a prefix open, so you can either craft life on there if you want. You can craft more life. I just crafted 7% of cold damage is extra chaos damage, but mainly on the shield you're looking for the +1 additional totem. In terms of like damage, any +1 additional totem is going to outweigh pretty much any other damage stats on the shield. For single target damage for sure. So just getting an additional totem there is huge, and the socketed gems have 10% reduced mana reservation. It's honestly not a huge deal for this build. It's more just like I found this shield for 3x, and I thought that was really cheap for it, so I just bought it and used it for the build. In some builds, this shield would be almost invaluable because it might allow you to run auras you couldn't otherwise run, especially if it's 15% reduced mana reservation instead of 10. But in this case, I kind of just picked it up and used it for this build. It's not mandatory at all. As you can see, we have 1500 mana. And if I were to... Let me see what I can do here. Okay, I'll take Prod Weakness out of here. I don't want to do that, actually, because... I'll just take everything out. Take everything out of here. I'll put Hatred in here. And then we'll cast it again. So it's not getting the 10% now. And as you can see, we're down to 1338. So you do gain, a decent amount of effective health there, but it's nothing like game breaking, really. It's just like a nice additional thing to have. Right. Put those back because that was yeah. So that's the shield. The boots. The boots I heavily debated a lot for this build. First of all, they don't have the right enchant. You're probably going to either want pen. Lightning damage seems like it would be good, especially with the additional effectiveness, but you're stacking so much cold pen that crit is actually better. Now the thing about crit is if you're going to be using the Orb of Storms power charge on kill setup, or power charge on use Orb of Storms to generate power charges, since you're going to be critting with the Orb of Storms, you're not really going to be able to take advantage of the crit chance on the boots at all for the implicit lab enchant. So if you're going to go that route, definitely don't get that. And pretty much the main enchant you want to be hunting for is the pen. But if you don't really care about getting crit chance, or if you don't really care about getting crit chance through power charges, generating power charges, so you're not going to be critting yourself, the boot crit chance is actually a really good option. So yeah, definitely something to keep in mind there. It's actually pretty much on par. Like if you're not counting the power charges in to the equation, it's on par with the pen enchant actually. So the crit enchant is really strong, assuming you're going to be able to reliably have it up. In terms of the actual boots, they don't need to be these boots, but I personally love Doriani's Illusion. The reason for that is they add a nice chunk of flat damage, which again is getting scaled with, it's the right type of damage too, because you can pick it, because they have one for each element. And it's getting scaled nicely with the extra damage effectiveness increase on Freezing Pulse, and has really solid life, really solid move speed, and 150 some ES. These are like god tier hybrid boots. And the purities are actually kind of nice because they're level 25 in the event that you'd want to use one. I personally don't want to use one in this build, but I think they're just really solid boot options. So you can replace it with any rare boot though. You could also go, if you want permanent onslaught all the time, and don't want to use a flask, and you want to put Wise Oak in there or something like that, you could use the boots from Incursion. The only thing is they don't really have much life or ES, so you're taking a survivability hit. The mana regen is not really a huge deal most of the time, but they do have a resist, which is nice. So if you're really running low on lightning res, they are a good option. They give you onslaught all the time, saves you the flask slot, so in that respect, it is really nice. Torment, Girdle, Stygian Vise. It's just you just get a Stygian Vise with resist, basically. I typically don't go too crazy for these and try to get something with any other type of crazy damage. I just pretty much use it for resist and ES and life. Even my jewel here is not really too insane. It's mostly just a resist jewel, but depending on how you change the resist around with the build, you can use different things in there, obviously. So gloves really have no hard. There's not really a pair of gloves that you need to use for this. For a while, as you probably noticed if you look back through my other guides, I was using Winds of Change. Now, Winds of Change is kind of good because it's projectile damage, projectile speed, which is the main thing we're looking for, with life. It's actually not terrible that they're an armor base because it kind of allows you to easily get your cast when damage taken set up on there. But it's also not really that hard to force a 3 red because that's something you can just do from the bench. So I think I did that in the helm in this case. So it's not like you really need to do that. It's not like a good reason to use them. And I think late game, ultimately, you're better off not using them because you can basically cover resist, cover projectile speed, and cover life a lot better and not have the move speed penalty using a rare pair of gloves. These actually weren't even that expensive at all. These were like 10C, I think, 20C, something like that. So not bad at all. And you can see they give 21 projectile speed. That's only like 9 less that you're going to get from the Winds of Change. They don't give the projectile damage, but they give a lot more life and 2 res basically I have here. So it allows your build to be a lot more flexible. You're also getting Energy Shield, which is nice because it helps contribute to your max ES right here. I think these are just way better option. You don't even need to have them as Elder Gloves, but if you really want the prod speed, you can get them. It's kind of something you can toss in there late game, right? So that's how I choose to go with gloves. Helm, pretty much just get a Hubris with the Freezing Pulse enchant. I think I used a couple greeds on this and got the hybrid life and ES with ES flat with life flat. Yeah, I used the 80 to 89. So I got really lucky on this one actually. And it's a pretty damn good helm because it has the resistance as well. So I think this is pretty much like what you can expect if you're really wanting to get life on your helm. This is probably the best you're going to get endgame around here because we have T2 flat ES, like T3 life and ES, and then we have a decent life value. So that's pretty much what you're going to expect around probably like 130 to like 170 ES and around, like 80 to, in this case, I got like 110 life. So this is like the upper end of being good for helm, and it'd probably be worth a decent amount, but these you really have to craft them yourself in a lot of cases, because the problem is that people typically, I don't think, are crafting a lot of insane Freezing Pulse helms, so it's really more going to be like if they enchant a helm that's already good, and it gets the Freezing Pulse projectile speed enchant, and they want to save it, then you'll get a good helm with it, but otherwise you're going to have to craft. In terms of the enchant itself, yeah, I mean, there's no better enchant, in my opinion, than the Freezing Pulse projectile speed, because the other ones just don't provide, I think it's 40% damage and 12% cast speed, right? And to me, it's just not a big enough damage increase to really warrant giving up that much prod speed, because projectile speed for Freezing Pulse is absolutely insane, and the more of it you can get, really the better you are, because it lets you deal your full damage at like a higher distance, essentially, which is super important. So I'd always go with the projectile speed enchant. It's something you really can't get enough of. If you really want more prod speed, actually, you can put a prod speed gem in the place of one of these, and then swap the other one out for bosses or something like that. But I find you can usually get enough prod speed between the gem levels. And if you use a wand, you can get some prod speed. If you use the gloves, you get it. I have some from the tree. There's kind of a lot of sources you can get it from now, so you can get it from the helm enchant. So yeah, there's that. Kikazar is pretty standard. We don't really corrupt them here. If you were super light on res, or if you had a ton of res, sorry, you could corrupt them to try and get like flat damage or something, but this is pretty tight in terms of res. Pandemonious, this is pretty much best in slot. Neck, I would say, by far, because the blind just makes it insane. So there's like, the pen is like a damage thing, right? And which is really good. Has a really high res. It's base dex neck, which is really good for this build because you struggle for dex. And it has 26% cold damage, so even from a damage perspective, it's an insane neck. Probably close to BIS neck. But then when you add in the fact that blind chilled enemies on hit, that's just insane. So, yeah. BIS neck, in my opinion, not really any debate there. Not needed for the build by any means, but it's good if you can get it. And yeah, so let's see what else. Oh, scepter. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I was using, I think, before. Okay, it's probably not 20x, by the way, but I kind of don't even want to sell it necessarily unless somebody really wants it. So this is what I was using before, and these are probably your most optimal damage stats. It's really just going to be a decision between, like, do you want to use shield charge or are you comfortable using flame dash? Now, this has a pretty decent flame dash setup, but it's not like one of those super fast under 1 second flame dash setups because it's too much investment to really get that. So it's not like an amazing movement skill in this build, but it's still pretty good. And if you play with your flask properly, especially onslaught and your quicksilver, I find that you don't find yourself missing it too much, but ultimately I just did miss it. I wanted the fortify and stuff like that, which you'll get from shield charge. Especially if you're on hardcore, you probably want to at least eventually think of swapping to a shield charge setup to get the fortify. It's really quite strong. But yeah, so this is what we were using beforehand. I would say if you're getting... Here's my thing with wands, right? So if you're getting a cheap wand, one of the things I love to do is to get the... there's a wand like mod that drops, I believe you might be able to get it from other things in the temple, like if you get like a level 3 weapons room or something like that. Not entirely sure how that works, but it's a cast speed mod with the flat chaos damage. I forget the exact name of the thing. Oh, I think I have one right here. Yeah. So it's Takati, I think, or yeah. The suffix mod here, the cast speed and the chaos dispels. That's an insanely good mod to start off with on a wand because I feel like a lot of times it's hard getting caster weapons with really high cast speed, and cast speed does a lot of damage for these types of builds. And then you're getting flat chaos, which is nice because it's chaos, and the damage effectiveness on freezing pulse is really high. So in terms of what you want to use for a freezing pulse caster build, that's a really good budget start because typically a lot of them they'll drop with decent stats on them in other areas, and you can kind of just craft the last stat that that it doesn't have on it, and you'll have a decent weapon. So I would recommend searching for wands to begin with that have that stat on them with other good spell damage things, and you just craft maybe one other thing and you have a decent wand, something like this. Basically, this is a great example. I think I picked this up for like 5-10 chaos, and I have it up for 2x. It's probably not worth actually 2x, but it's probably at least worth 1x, and it's just an example of you can find like crazy good deals on wands like this at the start of the league, especially in standard. So just something to keep in mind there. Now, in terms of late game, the mod that overtakes that in terms of precedence, I would say, is this gain elemental damage as extra chaos is actually kind of insane. So what I did here is I bought, excuse me, I bought the base, which I think was, I was actually cast speed, multi, and that mod for like 4 or 5x. I think it was 4.5x. And then I just multi-modded it with spell damage and cold damage to spells. Alternatively, you can try and craft something like this yourself by, you would just kind of like alt-aug and try and get the gain elemental damage as extra chaos with something good, and then regal and hope you get something decent. The problem is, so if you regal and you get something bad, right, in my opinion, unless you have god tier stats, maybe as the other two. So if you had a god-like prefix, like the 19%, and then you actually hit like 36 global multi, and then let's say you regal into something like shitty, like added fire damage, alright, but it's not even to spells, it's just to like attacks or something. Or let's say actually it's a bad suffix. So let's say it's like, I don't know, just like crit, but not the spell crit. It's like the normal crit or something like that. What you'd probably want to do here is you'd probably want to annul it, because if you annul it and you hit it, when you multiple crafted mods it, you can actually add another suffix that's going to be good for you, so you're going to get like more out of the multi-mod craft. Whereas if you just multi-mod it as is, then you'll still be able to do that, because at most you're going to have 2 suffixes on the item, right? So you add multi-mod, that's the 3rd suffix, but you're only going to be able to craft 2 prefixes. Now in this case, it already had a good suffix and cast speed, so you didn't need to add, like, or I didn't need to annul it or anything like that, and that's why the base was so expensive. But that's how I'd go about like crafting a late game weapon for this. Now that's on a wand for sure. And the thing with a wand is you're not looking for attack speed on it, because it doesn't affect, you're not going to use shield charge, so the attack speed doesn't affect the startup time or anything like that. Now, crafting a scepter, what you want to do is you're looking for a Karui base, probably. Maybe a Vol base would be acceptable, but I feel like if you're going to go for the craft, you almost might as well just go for the best, right? And you want a Karui base, and if you really want to get the best possible damage, then you're basically looking to get a Shaper, one of these, and you're trying to get the mod, because I believe you can still get the gain % elemental as extra chaos damage on there, I think. So you're trying to get that on the scepter. Basically, you want to double check on that though, before you craft like that. But what I opted to do, kind of like a cheaper method, is to get a still really good scepter. As you can see, is I went with one of the fractured ones, and in terms of 1 fractured mod versus 2 or 3, it really just depends. Like obviously, the more fractured mods you're adding, they need to be good mods because they're taking up space, right? So like you can't have, you don't want a good fracture mod with a shitty one. So like if you got something like 20, I think I have one here, I'm not sure. Or maybe not. Yeah, I think I bought it somewhere else, but it has like attack speed and, actually I think it's in the main slot. Attack speed and cast speed on it already, right? Now something like this, the thing is, you're better off like waiting, I think, until they make the change later this week, where you can essence craft stuff like this if you're trying to work with something like this, because otherwise you just kind of have to chaos spam it. And if you're essence or fossil crafting it, at least you have a lot more control. It's like, so you're already controlling 2 mods with the fractured. With an essence, you're controlling minimum 3, which is actually really powerful in terms of crafting. And a lot of the cheap essences still go for around a chaos. So it's effectively like you're chaos spamming. I actually had a bunch of chaos earlier. I chaos spammed this to try and get a good result. It's still kind of hard, to be honest. So if you're really trying to create a good rare, especially without multi-modding, I would definitely suggest waiting for the fossil options and the essence options in terms of crafting these. But the other way you can go is you can get 1 fractured mod, and what that allows you to do is to kind of cheaply spam it with alt-aug until you get something else you like. So in this case, I got tier 1 cold added as extra chaos, and for this build, that's almost essentially as good as our wand here. If we go back to freezing pulse, it's almost as good as our wand because our wand has 19% of elemental as extra chaos, but this build does primarily cold damage. As you can see, it's cold and chaos damage. There's almost like no other damage on the build, right? So it's really just like, what, 7% off what the wand is in terms of gain the elemental damage, which in this case is all cold damage, so it's basically the same. So you're not really losing that much damage here. And then once you get that other thing, you have to regal. Now, regal, you hope you hit something good. If not, you want to, in this case, I think you really want to go for the annul, because you already have one of the good mods locked in, being the attack speed, right? So you're not struggling to hit 2 really good tier 1s, which would take a lot of all aug, okay? Sometimes people would not go for the annul in that case if they're just trying to alt aug off the base, and because it takes so many alt augs to get like 2 really good tier 1s, then you really get something not good, but they're like, oh, I could still multi-mod it and make it decent, right? And then I'm done. But in this case, you're not actually spending a ton of alt augs because you already have one good mod locked in, so you really just need to hit one good prefix, which we did here. So you can kind of just keep going until you either get a good regal, or if you get a bad regal, you annul them, and you just want to annul the bad mod off, and then you're left with a rare item with the 27 attack speed, and in this case 12% of cold as extra chaos. You multi-mod, you craft spell damage, cold damage to spells, and cast speed, and then pretty much if you're using the exalt mods, I would try and divine it from there. But if you're not, well, actually you kind of have to divine it anyway, that's right, because you're using the multi-mod, but yeah, you can use either expensive stuff or cheap stuff, but make a really solid scepter, as you can see. This has a lot of damage on it, and the cast speed is amazing, and it's very responsive shield charge. Very responsive shield charge, especially with all this stuff up. So, yeah, so that's pretty much how you craft the weapon. And kind of going a bit in depth on that. And finally, we'll bring up the tree, and I'll talk a little bit about the ascendancy as well. So, let's actually talk about the ascendancy first. So, the ascendancy is pretty straightforward. You're always going to get Ritual of Awakening. You're probably always going to get Divine Guidance. The real question for most people becomes Sanctuary of Thought versus Conviction of Power. So I like Sanctuary of Thought for a couple reasons, right? First of all, 10% less mana reservation now becomes actually very important, because prior you didn't really use any auras with this build, so that was kind of wasted. And let alone like a 50% aura, right? But in this case, they buffed Hatred quite significantly, and Hatred is actually, in my opinion, good. It's a net positive to use for sure, because you can get a good Watcher's Eye with it. Prior, you could still obviously get the Cold Pen or something, or the flat damage to Hatred, but the actual Hatred aura wouldn't be doing anything, so it's not worth it all, right? But in this case, you're getting, like, what, 19% more cold damage. 18% more cold damage on top of the pen or the base crit or the flat added as. So when you pair it with a Watcher's Eye, it really is worth running, I believe, at least one aura. And you have that done there. And the reservation here really helps with that. It gives you some more mana to play around with for Mind Over Matter, especially if you crank your health up more and stuff like that. And you actually do gain a lot of effective HP from this node, because you're stacking a decent amount of mana. As you can see, we have 2,400 mana, so we get a decent amount of energy shield from that, and it just makes you pretty tanky, and it's damage that, or it's effective health that will help you against all types of damage. If you go over to Conviction of Power, I would say the damage bonus you get from this is relatively small, and you do get some reduced elemental damage taken when you have an endurance charge to elemental, and you get reduced damage taken to physical just by virtue of having endurance charges, right? So it is kind of just a bit of a trade-off. I personally like the more total, just effective, larger HP pool to tank a big hit, because in my mind, what this build is going to suffer to is like a one-shot type of thing, because most cases you're playing or multi-hits like really fast that are kind of like big hits that will consume a large health pool. So I'm basically looking to stack the health pool as big as possible so I can get either the logout, or my totems will freeze something, or they'll start attacking the totems, something of that sort, right? So I'm mostly just going to try and crank the max health through the roof. Now, the one problem you do run into when you get Sanctuary of Thought is when you're on full ES, your spells don't cost mana, which would seem good, but you want them to cost mana for Arcane Surge. So we fixed that by just adding, where is it here? A Fervid Mind Gem. And what that basically does is just allow you to cast Arcane Surge, because this doesn't reduce like your value to 0. It's sort of like additive, right? So it's like you can think of it as we're taking 100% of the cost away, but then we're adding it back in terms of this, right? So we're getting like our normal like totem mana cost when we're at full ES, and then we take ES damage, it's a little more, but we still are completely capable of maintaining that mana cost, so it doesn't really matter. So yeah, that's how we solve that problem, because Arcane Surge is super powerful and you really don't want to miss out on it. So I'll just say that. And the one thing is, this build does require a lot of jewel sockets. So in terms of like, it's got the 2 first snows, the Self-Flagnation, the Watcher's Eye, and the Fervid Mind. Obviously, the Fervid Mind and the Watcher's Eye are a little bit more late game when you get Uber Lab for the Fervid Mind, and for the Watcher's Eye when you can finally afford that. So, yeah, so that's that. And in terms of the actual pathing on the tree, so I think this is pretty optimal pathing in terms of like the best damage of survivability and damage, and that's why I'd recommend this for sure for softcore. It can be used in hardcore as well. It's just that I feel like what's going to happen is there are going to be certain periods, especially when transitioning, maybe you're trying to get into red maps and stuff like that, where you're going to want to kind of bolster your defense by maybe doing a different path before you get to late game, and then you can switch back to this if you want, because you have a decent amount of defense here, especially when you consider like all things like the Fortify, the Blind, you have Assault, you have a large amount of effective HP and stuff like that. But the problem is that getting all this set up can be a bit tricky in hardcore. So I'm actually doing a hardcore variant, which I can show you. I'll actually log out and log back in, but to show you the hardcore variant, but that has more HP than this, and it is essentially tankier but gives it some damage. But this is the best of both worlds. Just a couple notable things from the tree that I want to bring your attention to. So all this right here is really insane. Light of Divinity, Holy Dominion, Discipline and Training, these nodes, these are all super good. Mind Over Matter, insane. This cluster, very strong in terms of damage. This got buffed to fuck all. You need this in your build. Like, any type of elemental build you're playing, you need to have one of these if it corresponds, or multiple if you're doing multiple elements that can benefit, because these are just insane. Yeah, nothing else to say about that. This node's actually also insane. Yeah, it's just really good. Again, nothing too much to say. Nimbleness, this got buffed. This is really good. Movement speed, especially if you're not using a shield charge setup. Cast speed, crit multiplier, it's amazing. These nodes, like this whole thing right here, very good. Very easy decision to get some extra dex here to help with your dex requirement and to get into the your next jewel slot. Really efficient way to do it, in my opinion. Throat Seeker and Snowforged actually is pretty good now, especially if you're struggling on res, since each side has like a respective thing for cold and fire damage. Unfortunately, the fire one's better, but the cold one is still pretty decent. And the end node is insane because you get the res and stuff like that. And yeah, so those are, I think, the most notable differences on the passive tree. Only other thing I would say, oh yeah, and over here, arcane swiftness. If you're using a shield, this node is insane. Good nodes leading up to it, as you can see, and you're probably going to be around here anyway. As you notice, I don't have Doomcast, and that would be basically the final way you finish off this build. I would probably just snipe a point from somewhere else. Not entirely sure where I'd do it yet, but to try and get Doomcast, maybe take it from Fangs of the Viper, and then yeah, 1, 2, 3, and that would be the level 100 build in terms of like pure efficiency in terms of damage. But without using Unnatural Instinct. Now, if you're using Unnatural Instinct, you basically just come down here to grab this Jewel Socket, and you would have to play around with it more to see exactly what's worth giving up. But I just don't want to make the build focused around Unnatural Instinct because it's unnecessary, and just a lot of people aren't going to be able to afford it. But it is definitely good if you can get it. So something to keep in mind. And which side you come in on would just depend on whether you want attack speed for shield charge or if you want spell damage. If you're not using shield charge, it's a no-brainer. You just come into the attack speed side. That way you get all the stuff. So that's pretty much this version of the build. I'm going to just log over really quick to hardcore. There's a bunch of different ways you can make this build. I'm actually making going to make another version of it afterwards, which uses Leech and is an ascendant basically, so that'll be fun. And I can't cover all the different types of builds there, so I'll probably just save that. That's like a drastic variation which uses a different ascendancy, so I'll cover that in another video. But in terms of just the build structure for the hardcore build, the main difference here is you just come down into this and you grab the life wheel, and then if you want, you can get Totemic Zeal. I'm not sure if I'm going to get this yet because you already feel like you have a lot of placement speed. I may just get it to see how it feels. Usually I'll always take Totemic Zeal if I'm not playing Heirophant because you lose out a lot of placement speed. So to kind of make up for it. But basically you're just kind of getting really efficient crit, or a crit that's close to other things that you're going to get, like Life and Chaos. This crit's right here. Probably going to opt to get Throat Seeker instead of this because it's way more damage, assuming you don't need the placement speed or anything like that, and you really don't need the duration because you're playing Heirophant. So just popped up to get this. Obviously you need to get Frostwalker. You're going to be using a shield, but you probably really can't even afford to get this. That's how tight you are in this particular case. You can see we're still over here. We haven't had the need for the Watcher's Eye or anything yet, so we haven't branched out. So just it's getting a lot more life, as you can see, mainly getting the addition of the life wheel. And we're level 85 and we're already at 5.5k life. And we haven't taken our ascendancy yet, which is why our ES looks so low by comparison. Where is it here? We haven't taken our final ascendancy just because I haven't unlocked lab. But this is going really well and haven't really had any close calls. This man is going to get buffed quite significantly, probably at least to 1300 after the ascendancy. And we still have some nodes to take, still have some levels to get. So this is the tankier version. And oops, as you can see, using a soul mantle. Don't have a lot of insane gear yet. Just kind of using, whatever I can find. Hardcore is pretty dead, so it's hard to generate a lot of currency through sales, and hard to find a lot of what you need. Right now I'm just kind of crafting a scepter in my spare time here. And but yeah, still using the soul mantle, still using the Kikazaru, so definitely still viable on hardcore, and I'll give you the update as this guy gets higher in the levels. But yeah, it's pretty much, I think, about as comprehensive as it's going to get. Yeah, so if you have any questions or anything like that, just feel free to leave them in the comments. Don't worry about asking about specific stuff at all. I actually love responding to questions about specific stuff, so, yeah, don't hesitate there at all. And just thanks for watching. And like I said, I'll make the Ascendant version a completely different video because it's just be too much to cover in this. Yeah, hardcore version, softcore version. I'll put the POBs into both. On the oh, there's a CI version as well. That's the other thing I wanted to talk about. But I'm just going to make a new separate video for that because it's kind of like you're going a whole different effective life route there. So I'm gonna, which I may transition this guy to the CI route if I can get enough currency on hardcore. And even if I don't, I'll either transition the other guy to CI or I'll show you the tree in a different video because there's some major changes to the tree there. But CI is a definitely viable option for this, and the CI version I think is probably the best overall version. It's just going to be obviously a bit more expensive because the idea is that you're maintaining a lot of the damage that you do in the original softcore version of this build that I just showed you like 10 minutes ago, but you're gaining a lot of survivability because you're immune to chaos damage, and you can probably get around 8 to 9k ES relatively easily. If you get the right Watcher's Eye and stuff, you can push it even higher than that to close to 10k. So you have a lot of health, chaos immunity, and you're maintaining that same huge damage. Whereas this one, the damage is like, I would say, this is probably 2/3 of the damage of the other build, or a little bit less than 2/3. So yeah, but tankier obviously. So thanks for watching. Talk to you guys later.